the American Meteorological Society, for example. They've put forward this whole notion, and part of the reason I asked questions about this equity section in particular was, for one thing, they conflate opportunity and outcome in that, but also they seem to make very much the assumption that if you remove all barriers and give everybody all the resources they need and what have you, that you're going to have the same outcomes between groups of people or between individuals. And it's a poor assumption. It's a fairly damn poor assumption, given the prerequisites for different fields may require different things that individuals do not have. But yet, the scientific thinking required to do that, to make that statement, is not taught, and it's not necessarily being pushed as well by a professional society of scientists. So this comes to us from Natural Selection Substack, which is Heather Haying. And you've seen, of course, Heather Haying and Brett Weinstein on the Dark Horse podcast here. And it's certainly an interesting piece. You've seen me cover it on this channel previously, the formation of the new University of Austin, which was in its inception meant to push back on the problems with academia and hopefully get back as universities to truth-seeking institutions. Now, why, of course, do I talk about universities? Because universities are where we train the next generation of scientists. Recently, as you can guess from the title on screen, there's been a shakeup that Heather Haying decided she was going to resign last week from the board of the University of Austin, UATX. And so she published publicly the resignation letter, which she included here in the Substack, but she also included a lot of context. And it got me thinking about a few things. And if you were following me on Twitter, just scrolling down there if you're not, you can see that I had some interactions and conversations on it, because something that Heather points out is important, but there's also being careful distinction here between scientism and scientific thinking. Now, scientism in its simplest is the irrational kind of thought that science, not necessarily scientific process rather, but science, this thing science or scientists, can solve all ills and answer all questions. Which is fundamentally not true, because there's some things that are moral, philosophical questions that you might be able to use reason and logic to work through, along with the moral kinds of things from Enlightenment principles or the like. But you cannot answer that necessarily with a whole lot of evidence. And evidence might be about to inform that, but not the scientific process in that particular way, or shall we say just scientists in general just can't answer those questions for you necessarily, or just answer those questions based on that process. But that doesn't mean you can't use a scientific style. It's not coming across well what I'm trying to say, but there's a distinct difference. But let's get into this. So this is her resignation letter. Dear fellow board members, this is dated December 2nd. I am resigning from the board of the University of Austin. I sincerely hope that the University of Austin succeeds. If I had to place a bet right now, I bet that it will. Many of you and others leading the charge are uniquely qualified to bring such an institution to fruition. It is thus with a heavy heart that I have come to this decision. I am not compelled that the vision you are pursuing is sufficiently revolutionary. To fix higher ed, UATX would need to address the root causes of academic fragility, not just treat the symptoms that threaten its vitality in the present. That, in turn, would require an embrace of the counterintuitive and tolerance for a great deal more risk than I think is the appetite for in this group. So, I think what she's getting at is that the postmodernist stuff, colloquially woke, is pretty much a symptom of something that's built up pretty substantially over time. A lot of this got started in the 70s, if not earlier, in different universities, institutions, and what have you. And because it is very deeply in the roots there now, you can't just, or at least I'm hopefully classifying the argument correctly. You cannot just rip it right off the top and expect it to fix the problem. There's a lot of things that went kind of haywire with the universities and with higher education when all of this came together. And so it certainly becomes interesting when we think about, what do we do to fix it? And I don't disagree. In fact, I think I was actually very supportive, and I remain very supportive of the idea that we need new institutions. But the question is, I think what Heather gets at is that you can't improve upon the old if you're continuing to use the things that you know are failing, while just crimming off the little things that you can observably see are problems, and not diving into the roots that allowed those problems to take hold. If I might offer you one piece of advice as I bid you a heartfelt farewell, should you ever wish to retrace your steps to determine where the founders misstepped, should you want to know how the University of Austin ended up trapped in the next academic quagmire, the answer is in the arm's length treatment of science. Science is not an ingredient that can be added to taste in such an endeavor. It is a reliable North Star, structurally indifferent to the ebb and flow of belief that drives great institutions off the road. The causal approach to science in the formulation of, the casual approach to formulation, try that again. The casual approach to science in the formulation of UATX is both cause and effect in this story. The only process powerful enough to protect an institution from madness, not just woke madness, but every version of lunacy, is science properly practiced. But to build this into new institutions, you would have to rescue this ancient tool from the corruption of the modern Research One universe. R1 being Research One University, usually. So, what she's annoyed with, apparently, is that Austin didn't take the whole idea of truth-seeking as seriously, which it's possible. It's distinctly possible that that's part of the problem. And she's not wrong, actually. I very much agree with the notion that if you are very much about seeking the truth with these kinds of things, which is what ultimately the process that is science is the seeking of the truth with respect to different questions of interest. In fact, matter with respect to all the questions in mind. Because I mean, in the video earlier this week on the fundamental biology, the guy was asking questions. Why is this? Ooh, what the heck? And maybe it leads to why. It leads to why are we kind of thing. Ultimately, it's the answering of questions in the pursuit of the truth, and then also communicating that knowledge. If you've got the university side of things, communicating that and inculcating that in the next generation. But it's difficult to do that if any kind of ideology takes hold of one or the other. And make it perfectly clear, I'd have a problem with it if it wasn't the woke madness, the postmodern madness, but a more religious theocratic ideology that was taking hold of everything, religious and, like traditional kind of religious practice, be it Christian, Muslim, what have you, that was just taking hold of everything. I'd have just as much of a problem with that in the context of what a university is supposed to be doing, and what university professionals are supposed to be doing, and in the context of what scientists are supposed to be doing. Your job is the pursuit of the truth. Your ultimate purpose, your telos, is that. But it's hard to do that if you've got more focus on ideology. So on our very first day in May of 2021, someone joked that I was the token liberal in attendance. A year and a half on, I think it an unfortunately profound observation. It seems that others on the board have trust in existing elite institutions, except for the relatively new and remarkably widespread problems that we can all see. The abandonment of free speech, the rise of wolf in sheep's clothing diversity, equity, inclusion offices, the abandonment of due process, the ascendancy of institutionally sanctioned bigotries, the bloating of administrations and staffing them with ideologues to achieve political goals. These are serious threats. This is a genuine crisis. But these are symptoms, not etiology. Probably butchered the pronunciation. The symptoms can be treated, but if the causal pathology is not addressed, the fix is assuredly temporary. And in this, I agree with her. Because a lot of the stuff that we're seeing now, you started sowing that in the 60s, 70s. You don't just rip that off the top and expect it to go away when you're not dealing with the root of the problem necessarily. Our universities will not be effective truth-seeking institutions if we simply scrape woke off the top. The rot is far deeper, the product of a kind of analytical immunodeficiency. Terrible ideas took over a system in which new ideas and the discussion thereof were increasingly rare. Higher ed needs a fundamental framework of truth-seeking with built-in error correction that scientific inquiry provides if it is to evade this fate in the future. Now, I'm going to add one finer point to this because there is one distinct problem with the potential with scientific inquiry and what have you, and that it depends very strongly right now. Well, no, it's always depended very strongly, let's put it this way, on having people in peer review who were also dedicated to truth-seeking over narrative and ideology. And I think what's been a concern with things in peer review, and you've actually seen, this came up on Twitter actually a while back, was that a scientist was doing peer review of an article and she rejected the article, figured out how to reject the article, if you will, because it wasn't supportive of the narrative on masking and COVID, or masking in kids, excuse me, with respect to COVID. It didn't support the narrative, so she had to make sure it was rejected. That was the way she was approaching it. That is not a thing about truth seeking. And so scientific inquiry itself can actually fall apart. Now, that's not to discount what Heather's saying here. If you're doing scientific inquiry correctly and you're engaged with that principle of organized skepticism, it can work very well, but it is dependent upon everybody who's involved in that process, or most everybody who's being involved in that process, also being interested in pursuing the truth at the very least, or having counterpointing views to make sure everybody's biases are pointed out, as would be the argument of Jonathan Rauch, or the discussions of Jonathan Rauch in the Constitution of Knowledge. He talks about this. And so I would point that out, actually, is a thing here, is that, yes, it does need a fundamental framework of truth-seeking, but to presume that error correction is perfect in scientific inquiry processes is kind of ignoring a bigger problem that we have right now, in that if you have more people who come at it from the same worldview and the same bias of ideology and not dedicated to truth-seeking themselves, then even that scientific inquiry error correction can fall apart. And so that's a bulwark that has to be built in there somehow. Nearly everything from early 21st century universities could be reimagined to good effect. The two most pressing issues that I see are the need for science for everyone, not just those who think of themselves as scientists, and for new thinking on curriculum and pedagogy, in part to help realize the potential of vast numbers of brilliant students who are ill-served by traditional academic settings, but also to better educate everyone, especially in science, which is particularly enfeebled by standard approaches. I have spent decades enmeshed in these topics, including dedicated focus for a year shortly before UATX was formed on the Beringia project. Along with Brett Weinstein, the other co-founder of that project, we made considerable progress identifying deep additional flaws, I should say, that would need to be addressed to reach the next phase of higher ed. A full restructuring of the modern university would include, but not be limited to, reconfiguring faculty hiring and firing, treatment and role of adjuncts, faculty autonomy, governance, administrative structure, admissions, residential life, tuition, grades, accreditation, academic departments, majors, libraries, study abroad. Unfortunately, between that model and the one being planned for UATX lies too substantial a valley to be crossed, and that is why, despite believing that UATX will be a better school than most or all of what currently exists, I must leave the project. Okay, so she's got a lot of good thoughts in here, and I think there's more further down, so I'm not going to belabor this too much, in that I agree. There's a hell of a lot of problems, and I haven't been in an academic setting anywhere nearly as long as she has. Um, that there's tremendous amount of problems. And to presume that it's just administration with a bunch of these different things with DEI and what have you, no, it's certainly not. And you've noticed that if you've been following this channel, that there's a lot of this crazy crap in crazy woke crap into STEM fields at this point, too. So it's not certainly not alone there, but yeah, it doesn't. It I don't necessarily disagree with her that there needs to be a lot more that's reimagined, and I'm not sure that UATX is doing enough. At least from what I've seen thus far. And she obviously knows more than I do. I haven't seen all the details. I'm not on their board. But this is where I also get, how do I put this? The question I would ask is it better to have an iterative step toward the direction that you ultimately want? Or is it better to just go for the whole enchilada all at once? I could see the argument for that both ways, to be truthful. But there's more to it down here. I hoped back in May of 2021, when the University of Austin was but a glimmer in a few people's eyes, that it could be revolutionary, that it could successfully take on the problems facing modern universities and therefore the world. After a year and a half of pushing unsuccessfully in that direction, I am throwing in the towel. It is better to separate myself from the university than to have my name be attached to an institution that does not represent my scientific and pedagogical values. I truly do hope that you succeed in creating this new university, one that attracts faculty, staff, and students alike, one in which discussion is not tamped down by censorship, explicit or otherwise, and one in which the excesses and confusions of the diversity, equity, diversion, inclusion, and equity movement are shut down. These things need to happen, but they are far from sufficient. Okay. So I want to make a point with the additional context here because she makes some points that I think are quite valid, that I have mentioned more than a few times, and that others who are talking about K through 12 issues have also mentioned with respect to science. The ability to think scientifically for individuals and for educated the ability to speak well would be a good one there too. Sorry. I'm having a day here. The ability to think scientifically is critical for individuals and for an educated populace. By this, I do not mean that everyone needs to know how to run a PCR, principal components regression, by the way, or even know what PCR is, or its limitations or its implications. Rather, the scientific thinking that is critical for educated people to engage in includes observation, pattern recognition, recognition of bias and assumption, hypothesis generation, and experimental design, even if just at a theoretical level. So, yes, this is the thing that I mean. She's not saying that you can use this to answer all questions. Okay. She's not saying the scientism argument that science can answer all questions and resolve all ills and all problems in the world, when it is specifically not designed to do that. Rather, that the process of thinking that way is critical for the education kind of thing. She's pointing to the things about logic and reason and what have you, here, that most folks do really need, actually, in particular fields. And I apologize, I just had a cat issue here a moment ago. So that's actually what she's pointing to. Every educated person needs to be able to take an idea that they think is true, identify what could constitute evidence that it's not, and figure out how to go about attempting to falsify it. Epistemology, the study of how it is that we make claims of truth and what constitutes evidence for and against them, should be a core pursuit in a university that claims to be about the pursuit of the truth. Every scientific endeavor, therefore, a great number of human endeavors should begin with, how do I know what is true, and how will I be assessing claims of truth going forward? And I would add the addendum that it should be, if you're in a particular discipline, you're talking about the truth with respect to whatever you're studying. So that might be a particular thing. And it doesn't, because you're not going for the truth about why do we exist kind of thing. Some of those deep philosophical questions necessarily, at least with respect to science. There's other things there, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't inculcate that. That's not what I'm saying. In part because math and science are generally taught badly in the K through 12 system by people who don't understand the creativity and joy to be had in those topics, most smart children end up believing themselves to be bad at math or science, and therefore most smart adults believe the same thing about themselves. This is largely an effect of the educational system. It is not intrinsic to children. College is not too late to reinvigorate scientific thinking. Scientific thinking awakens us in a sense of wonder and awe, of discovery and of exploration. There are still many things new under the sun to discover. Scientific thinking lights us a sense of the possible. What if? Okay. I don't necessarily disagree here in the sense that if you got back to actually doing scientific thinking at colleges, it could be helpful to right the ship. Problem is, scientific thinking is not being inculcated anywhere. I've talked about this a lot with Deb Film and the reason we learn. The ideas of scientific thinking aren't even being taught in K through 12 education. They're not being taught in college education right now. Not really, anyway. What you're being taught as in science, in most cases, at least from what I can find at the university, is the notion that these facts constitute science, which is really, really awful. But the notions of scientific thinking aren't even being taught at a young age. And so I don't know if you're coming in with students who don't like it, and in some cases may despise it because of what they've been taught in the sort of woke sense that's also in K through 12 schools. There's no guarantee that that's going to work to reinvigorate it. It's certainly a step in the right direction. I'm not saying don't do it, but there's no guarantee, I don't think, with that, given the way the K through 12 system is now in the United States. But that is a whole other thing there, I think. Let's see. Trying to think, she's got a lot here, so I'm trying to make sure I get to the actual good components. I don't want to read through everything because this will get to be a very long video if I do that, because she did put a lot in here. So I encourage you to come back and do it. So come back and read through it. So because I don't agree. She puts this in the context of what would be needed in a curricular structure. The rigorous, difficult. Okay, here we go. To be educated requires more than that you have read books and responded to them. Education requires doing actual things in the physical universe, attempting to solve problems that appear intractable, or for which you do not feel that you have the right tools. Becoming the kind of person who is independent and self-sufficient and also capable of collaboration when that is called for. The world's elite schools are producing graduates who don't know how to think, can't solve problems, and have not done anything outside of narrow academically prescribed work that is the very definition of make work. Having students stew in their own uncertainty, their own confusion, their own dashed assumptions forces awareness and capability in nearly all of them. The rigorous, difficult, and uncomfortable, but also joyous, exploratory, serendipitous education of undergraduates is possible. I did it for a long time. To accomplish that, you need professors who know something real, and believe in the humanity of their students. You need a curricular structure that provides time, space, and freedom. Time with the students. Optimally, this means full-time programs where the faculty actually come to know real things about their students, what drives them, how they think, where they refuse to think, and what their assumptions are. Time to put an idea in their heads one day and return to it the next and the next. Time spent informally getting to know one another, breaking bread together, sitting around campfires together. Time to develop ideas, to go down wrong paths, to discover their errors and yours. Time to return to the last place where you stood on firm analytical ground and investigate it anew. Space to explore pedagogically, analytically, and geographically. And this first one right here is one thing that I don't think students are taught often. And what she's basically saying about it here is that learn how they learn. And one of the best things you can figure out if you're in school right now is, how do you learn? What is your best way of learning stuff for yourself? Because that is seriously not one size fits all as much as K through 12 has tried to do that. Um, it's not one size fits all. It's certainly not one size fits all in college either. And that's where I think she's quite right in that. And that is a better way to teach students. Freedom to do so. Freedom of speech is a given, but freedom to think and to teach how and what is best suited to the material and the faculty and the students is also necessary. Faculty autonomy is critical in a functioning university. Having faculty yahoos too often take over faculty senates and university administrations and changed universities for the worse, spreading a thick layer of woke on it. Okay, sorry. Faculty yahoos too often taken over faculty senates and university administrations and changed universities for the worse, spreading a thick layer of woke on everything. Yes, they have. The solution is not to remove autonomy from yet to be hired faculty at a brand new institution. The solution is not to hire Yahoo faculty in the first place, and when they show up, despite the best efforts of hiring authorities, to fire them quickly. So, I do very much agree. I mean, the problems are here that I don't think it's just universities that need to be reinvigorated at this point. And reinvigorated in the manner to go at what she's talking about. That this kind of thing about scientific thinking matters. And the reason I say that is because, unfortunately, this thing about scientific thinking and the lack thereof of it is not just lacking at universities currently, or in K through 12. It's also lacking in other things that have been built from them, such as the professional societies of scientists. And we talked about this last week, but here in the American Meteorological Society, for example, they've put forward this whole notion. And part of the reason I asked questions about this equity section in particular was, for one thing, they conflate opportunity and outcome in that, but also they seem to make very much the assumption that if you remove all barriers and give everybody all the resources they need and what have you, that you're going to have the same outcomes between groups of people or between individuals. And it's a poor assumption. It's a fairly damn poor assumption, given the prerequisites for different fields may require different things that individuals do not have. But yet, the scientific thinking required to do that, to make that statement, is not taught, and it's not necessarily being pushed as well by a professional society of scientists. And so the other thing, of course, is things like this, the unlearning racism in geosciences thing I've talked about on this channel many times. And you can previously, but you can also do a Google search on this, and you can find many universities are offering this now in their geosciences departments. And it is very much based on critical theory and postmodern principles, as I've talked about previously. And so I very much agree with Heather here that I would like to see universities get back to serious truth seeking. And I think some of the ideas that she had here, which I unfortunately don't have all the time to go into, are actually really great ways to start getting at that. So I totally agree in that sense. Do I think that's the only thing that needs a revamp? No. At this point, I do not. I do think a lot of professional science societies have similar problems, and a lot of professional societies, for many disciplines, perhaps have those same problems. I'm only speaking for the ones that I know of with the science disciplines, but those need to be addressed too. And perhaps, I mean, I'd be curious to know the thing here, because there is the difference between scientific thinking and the invocation of scientism, which is the idea of scientism being that science can solve all ills, and the irrational belief that science can solve every single question, including the moral and philosophical ones. There are some things that you don't necessarily have evidence for, so that doesn't necessarily work if you're talking about data and analytics and what have you. But at the same time, that's not what she's going for, I don't think. And I would leave that to her to say, because I can only take a guess. But I didn't get, I saw some folks arguing about this on Twitter. So I'm going to say, I didn't get the notion that she's saying that science can solve all ills. Rather, what Heather is saying here, that teaching scientific thinking and how to approach things with reason, and logic and evidence and what have you, can be quite useful and is critical for a population that is educated, which I think she has it up here. Yeah, the ability to think scientifically is critical for individuals and for an educated populace. She is not saying science can solve all ills. She is saying thinking scientifically is critical for that populace to be able to solve their own ills. Put it that way. And so I don't think she's going that way with the scientism side of things, but I do agree with her, and I'm pleased to see her pushing this. Like I said, I go back and forth on the idea that maybe UATX is an incremental step toward what you really want to see. But that's just a thought. I could see it going both ways. Do you incrementally step towards you want, or do you try and make the leap all the way on the first go? But such is the case. So I think this is really interesting and fascinating to look forward to. I don't know if UATX has had any particular response as of yet to her leaving the board of the university, but we shall see. I will pop this up here just for the record that this is the UATX principles on their website. So in general, I like the University of Austin's mission. I'm waiting to see what more happens, because I am not privy to things on the board the way she is, to see what else comes of it, and if there is more here, because I do agree that a huge amount of universities need to get revamped to make sure that scientific thinking is brought back, and that a whole lot of the things that started many, many, many decades ago finally go by the wayside. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious, folks.